Thank you, Todd. First thing I want to say is I have a cold, so I will try to speak up, and hopefully my voice will last long enough to get through the presentation. Anyway, I want to tell you a bit about my background, at least in this area. Because as a chemist, I never used evolution, or was never taught evolution in school. But as a scientist, I'm certainly interested in other fields of science. So about 20 years ago, I ran across a book by Philip Johnson called Darwin on Trial. And that was a critique of evolution. And it raised some very important questions about whether evolution made sense or not. That was followed by a number of other books. And today the topic is very active, especially in the U.S., but also in other parts of the world. I became a person who looked and read everything I could on the subject. So at this point, I am one who I think pretty well knows what's going on out there, and have talked to many people and know many people in this field. So even though I'm a chemist, I've studied the subject a lot. I became very heavily involved in 2000 to 2002 in Ohio, when I was on the state committee that was preparing new science standards for public schools. And I was on the committee that talked about life sciences and evolution. I was the only member of that committee that raised any questions about how evolution should be presented. Well, I got a rude awakening in those 2 years, and I know a lot more now than I did back then. A couple of years ago, some of us across the country formed COPE, and our main objective is to get objective and neutral education in public schools, not just in science, but our primary emphasis is on science. And our big project right now, last fall, we sued the state of Kansas over the Next Generation Science Standards. That's the new national science standards. Some of you may have heard of them. That they're trying to get into all the states. But so far, only 8 states have adopted them. So that's sort of where I come from. The talk tonight will consist of several things, and this is basically an outline. There are handouts, and the handouts just have my slides on them. So if you didn't get one, I see there's some in the front row. First, I'll give an introduction. Then we'll talk some about biological evolution, and I'll finish with evidence from nature, and especially the fossil record, which was what I was basically asked to talk about. Since this is the first talk in this series, I'm going to make it very gentle and introductory. Some of you may know the terminology, and if so, it'll be just a review. But for those of you not very familiar with the terminology, I want to give you definitions, some of the terms we use, and some of the feelings and impressions that one gets in the field. Okay, first question, what is evolution? Evolution in a general sense is simply change over time. This dictionary definition says it's a process of continuous change from a lower, simpler, or wish condition to a higher, more complex or better state. So, in evolution, we're talking about moving from a simple system to a complex system. Nature doesn't really work that way. Nature tends to go from complexity to simplicity. So right off the bat, evolution is questionable as a tenet of nature. But for example, evolution does not have to deal necessarily with biology. It can deal with anything. Evolution of flight, for example, you start out with balloons, you move to propeller planes, and then jets, and maybe spaceships after that. So we use evolution in a lot of senses, not just in biology. Very important that you realize that evolution in science is a naturalistic or materialistic theory. Naturalism and materialism mean essentially the same thing. In church, we sometimes look at materialism as meaning being concerned with physical things like cars and houses. Well, that's not what we mean in biology or in science. Naturalism or materialism is a doctrine or belief that cause and effect laws, the laws of chemistry and physics, are adequate to explain everything about the universe, and that teleological conceptions of nature and teleology is a word that I like. It means design or purpose. Teleology searches for intentional or design or purpose in nature. But evolution is a naturalistic theory. It rejects all supernatural or spiritual aspects to existence. So you see immediately that evolution is at odds with people of faith that believe in a God. Evolution in science is in three different areas. And I'll talk very briefly about the first two and then more detail about the third. Cosmic evolution concerns the evolution of the universe, how the universe got started, the formation of matter, energy, space, and time. Chemical evolution deals with the origin of life on Earth. That is the hypothetical creation of the first living cell from inanimate matter. Biological evolution concerns the origin of the diversity of life. As the evolutionists believe, you start with that one simple cell and you go to everything else that we have today, plants, animals, humans, anything derived from that first original cell life on Earth. First, briefly, cosmic evolution. Most of you probably know that the Big Bang Theory is the main leading theory today for the evolution of the universe. It posits that the universe started as a point or a singularity, and then an expansion, a great expansion occurred with the creation of matter, energy, space, and time. Many of you may not realize that space and time have not always existed. Matter and energy have not always existed. They started with the Big Bang. Also, the physical constants of the universe are fine-tuned so that life can develop. And there's a whole lot of papers recently on this subject, and I'm talking about things like the speed of light. They have to be very precise values, and there's over 20 of these variables, and really a lot more than that have to have very precise values for the universe to evolve like it did, and for life to have the chance to come into being. Okay, very important. The Big Bang implies that the universe had a beginning. Basic logic says that if anything has a beginning, it must have a beginner or a creator-designer. Many naturalistic scientists don't like the Big Bang because of this. If the universe had a beginning, then naturalism is not true. Naturalism is only true if the universe has always existed. Therefore, right off the bat, if you believe in the Big Bang, and most scientists do, it rules out naturalism. But nevertheless, most science is naturalistic. But the Big Bang is inconsistent with naturalism. Okay, next, chemical evolution. I only have one slide on this one as well. The main problem with chemical evolution is the complexity problem. And other speakers will address the complexity problem, and I'll just barely mention it. One of the speakers, Chris Williams, will be here in a couple of weeks, a friend of mine back there. He's very good at explaining complexity in biomaterials. Chemical evolution is the theory that the first living cell was put together and somehow life began from inanimate, non-living matter on Earth by itself without any outside intervention. Biological molecules are very complex and specific. Here's an example of a protein. They have to be put together in exactly the right way, and they have a shape in space that has to be exactly correct. The simplest cell is not really simple. This is a simple bacterium. It has numerous intricate parts that all must be arranged and put together for it to live, for it to function. And there's no reasonable mechanism by which biological molecules in the cell could have originated by naturalistic mechanisms alone. And even most origin of life researchers will admit this. They're still looking for a theory that will allow them to say that life could be created from non-life. I don't think they'll find it. Evolution in science, therefore, from cosmic evolution, we learned that the Big Bang implies a beginning to the universe, and that the universe is fine-tuned for life. Chemical evolution tells us that the complexity of nature just couldn't have happened by accident. And now we'll look at biological evolution, the origin of the diversity of life, and let's ask the question if this has similar problems. There are three meanings of biological evolution. The first is just change over time, and then we have microevolution and macroevolution, and I'll try to explain each of these independently. Change over time is no problem. These are two depictions of different periods in the Earth's history. First, modern marine life on the bottom and Cambrian marine life on top. As you'll see, the kinds of plants and animals that are there are very much different. So change over time simply means that in different geologic time periods, different species of plants and animals existed. There's no controversy really over that. The question is, how did the change occur from one period of geology to the next? What is the cause for the change? The question is not whether change occurred, but how it occurred, or what's the cause. Microevolution is a well-accepted concept as well. I've used here a simple example of dogs. These are all the same species. They all have the same body parts, the same body plan, but they vary a lot in size, coloration, and various minor features. But they're all dogs. They can interbreed, and they're all listed as the same species. So microevolution is minor genetic variation within a species. And it is also defined as a change in the genetic composition, that is the distribution of traits or genes of a species through successive generations. And this means that the genes are already in the system, but they have different distributions in different subspecies or different strains. And in microevolution, we're not talking about new traits or new genes. We're just talking about the distribution of existing traits within a population. This is limited variation. It's important to note that it does not result in new body plans or body parts. That is macroevolution, which is generally described as descent with modification from a common ancestry, and it does involve new body plans and body parts. Darwin, and this is 150 years ago, he really had great insight for the time, and he didn't know a lot of the stuff we have today. He thought a cell was just a little blob of protoplasm. He didn't know about all the complexity in the cell. And he didn't know how variation occurred either. But he did observe that variable traits are observed in various species, and new traits develop over time, where he thought they did. And if new traits developed that give an advantage to the organism, then it will be selected by nature. And generally, various factors contribute to whether a natural selection process changes. If the species is in competition with other species for the environment of the food supply, if the climate changes, if there's a catastrophe like an earthquake or a meteor, that will cause changes in the environment that will cause different traits to be selected because they give an advantage to the species. Neo-Darwinism is Darwin's theory combined with modern genetics. Again, Darwin 150 years ago didn't know about genetics, he didn't know about cell structure, he didn't know about DNA. But his mechanism that he developed is still assumed to be true by most environmental, or rather most biologists that are in this field. But it is controversial. Darwin proposed a tree of life in which we start at the bottom of the slide with one single common ancestor, which is assumed to be a very simple cell like a bacterium. And over time, new traits develop, and over millions of years, billions of years even, all the species that we have today are formed. We asked three questions, and I'll discuss each of these individually. Is the proposed mechanism for macroevolution feasible? Do intelligent design and/or creationism provide a reasonable alternative to Darwinism? And is the evidence from nature consistent with Darwinian common descent? First question. Darwin's mechanism is really an extrapolation. Probably you're familiar with that term from mathematics, where you take some points and you extrapolate. You predict, based on the points that you have, something else will occur. Darwin proposed that microevolution, small genetic change over long periods of time, results in macroevolution. That is, new parts, new body parts, and new body forms. But we have to remember that microevolution and macroevolution are different. In microevolution, the variation is already there. It's in the gene pool. We're not developing new genes. We're not developing new traits. They're already there in the gene pool. It's just that the distribution of those traits changes in the population. In macroevolution, however, the variation is proposed and has been proposed to come from mutations, which are changes in the DNA structure. Now, mutations do occur, but there are two major problems with this assertion. First, mutations cannot produce new features, and lots of different experiments in the last few years have demonstrated that mutations have limits. In general, they are harmful or neutral to the organism and often cause death of the organism when they occur. So mutations cannot produce new features. If mutations can't do it, what else is there that could do it? Well, they don't know. Mutations in the movies and comic books are quite common. X-Men, for example. But new features require new genetic information. And I'll take this from a book by Lee Spetner, a very good book, Not by Chance, where he talks about mutations. Any theory that is supposed to explain Darwin's concept of descent must explain the growth of information and complexity. Information and complexity. There aren't any known clear examples of mutation that has an added information. Mutations don't add information to the gene pool. They detract. They degrade the gene pool. And so, over time, accumulation of mutations in the gene pool reduces the fitness of the organism. Mutations from any source do not qualify as new feature-producing agents. That from the Cambrian explosion by Walter Starkey. So really, beneficial mutations only work in comic books and movies. They don't really work in real life. A little more on mutations. These graphs are taken from a book by J.C. Sanford called Genetic Entropy. I don't want to talk about entropy, it's a complicated subject, but it's very important to the whole discussion. Entropy is basically a degradation of nature. Nature tends to degrade itself over time. Organisms tend to degrade over time. They tend to lose fitness or ability to survive. The top graph was made for humans, and it shows the number of generations up to 300, which would be about 10,000 years. And originally, the original humans had excellent fitness, 100%. The genes were totally good. But over time, that degradation occurs, and at this point in time, it's been estimated that, whatever this is, 0.05%, 0.05% fitness is all that's left. Another way to look at it is lifespan. And this is taken from the Bible and other sources. Lifespans, as we all know of the early patriarchs in the Bible, were quite long, thousands, up to 1,000 years almost in some cases. But that lifespan has degraded over time, and is degraded so much that if it weren't for modern medicine, it would be a lot less than it is now. But these graphs for humans apply to any species. At present, the human race is degenerating genetically due to rapid mutation accumulation. It's those darn mutations again, the bad ones. And genetic information is being lost in the gene pool, and that leads to reduced fitness or abilities to survive. And from this, we can reach the conclusion that life cannot really evolve for millions of years without accumulating damaging mutations that lead to extinction. There's no viable naturalistic mechanism that can lead to the type of changes needed for new body parts and new body plans. Well, there are basically been proposed two alternatives to evolution. And I'm not going to go into great detail on either one, but I simply want to give you the basics. The first alternative is biblical or scientific creationism. It's known by either one of those terms. Creationism, in its modern form, came about in the 1970s, first by Henry Morris, who's with the Institute of Creation Research, or was before he passed away. So it was around during the 70s and 80s and served as the only challenge to, the only effective challenge to evolution theory. Creation scientists basically look for evidence in nature that supports a literal interpretation of the Bible. And these are some of the main tenets of what we call young earth creationism. There's also old earth creationism, but young earth creationism is the most prevalent. It believes there's a young earth, only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, based on the genealogies in the Bible. It accepts a literal interpretation of Genesis creation days, 6 24-hour days. It posits that there was no death on earth before the fall of Adam and Eve. And it also argues for the coexistence of man with extinct species. If you look in creationist literature, you'll often see a man and a dinosaur in the same picture. And I don't know if that happened or not. And a very important part of young earth creationism is flood geology, the worldwide flood of Noah, depicted in the early chapters of Genesis. Young earth creationism predicts that most geologic deposits, not all, but most around the world, were caused by that single worldwide flood. So those are the main tenets. Intelligent design is quite a different kind of theory. Intelligent design originated in the late 1990s. The first book on intelligent design was Michael Behe's book in 1996, Darwin's Black Box. And then 2 years later, there was a book called Intelligent Design, written by William Dembski, a statistician, mathematician. And that was the beginning of intelligent design. So creationism was around for over 20 years before intelligent design came on the scene. The idea is a scientific theory that proposes that intelligent causes explain the origin of many systems in biology. It does not propose that all systems require intelligence to be formed. It certainly accepts microevolution and maybe even some macroevolution of a very minor nature. But intelligent design provides a way to look at the evidence and determine whether or not there's good evidence for intentional design of living systems. And I don't have time to go into that. Maybe one of the other speakers will. But there have been algorithms developed to look at evidence from nature and determine whether or not it comes from an intelligent source. In general, structures and processes that have high complexity and high specificity, that is, high information content, are more likely the result of intelligent design. And the prime example that's usually used of intelligent design is the bacterial flagellum. This was Michael Behe's originally talked about it in his 1996 book, Darwin's Black Box. The flagellum is this small filament on a bacterium that propels it through liquids. And it's like a molecular machine. It's very complex, has several proteins in it. They must all be together and functioning for the flagellum to work. You can't just put one piece together and then another piece and eventually it'll work. You have to put them all together at the same time. And that cannot be done by naturalistic mechanisms. It has to be put together by an intelligent agent. There's an uneasy alliance between creationism and intelligent design. I know a lot of creationists, I know a lot of intelligent design people. They agree on a lot of stuff. There's only some stuff they don't agree on. And I find that in most cases, both of them are quite willing to talk about the evidence and discuss the truth, but they have different perspectives. Creationists and ID proponents both agree that scientific evidence for design exists in nature. The creationist's main complaint is that ID doesn't go far enough. That is, ID does not identify God as the designer or creator. Well, ID doesn't identify God because the scientific evidence doesn't identify God. So, you can't really say that God is the designer from the scientific evidence. That has to come from faith. And most ID proponents are Christians, not all, but most, and they believe in God, but they believe in God because of their faith and not because scientific evidence proves that there is a God. The distinction may be subtle, but that's basically the difference. ID proponents in general don't like to talk about the Bible, interpretations of the Bible, the age of the earth, and Noah's flood. Why? Because those are controversial issues, and they'd rather concentrate on the things that both creationists and ID people can agree on. Namely, that you really don't need these other biblical factors to show real design in nature. And that's what ID tries to do, is to show scientifically that design occurs in nature. Now, the last part of the talk, we'll talk some about the fossil record, which is the most important line of evidence used to support naturalistic evolution. Fossils were recognized as the remains of ancient life back in the 1700s. Before that, scientists, and there wasn't really too much science before the 1700s, believed that somehow nature just put these things in the rocks. They didn't know how they got there. But in the 1700s, they came to the realization that these were actually remains of ancient life. And some of them are simply impressions in rock. One here on the right is actually an insect that's trapped in amber. So there are various kinds of fossils. Darwin said this about the evolution process. He said, natural selection acts only by taking advantage of slight successive variations. She can never take a great and sudden leap, but must advance by short and sure, though slow steps. That's from The Origin of Species. What Darwin basically says is that you can't have sudden leaps. Evolution takes place slowly. The changes take place very slowly, so that you don't just start from, say, a bacterium and get something else like a fish. You have to go through many stages where there's small variations add up to a different species. So therefore, what would we expect from the fossil records based on an evolutionary model? The first is gradual appearance of new species. That's what Darwinism is, gradual appearance. So you would expect species to originally gradually. You would see transitional forms that show various features developing over time. You would expect to find many transitional forms between the various species. At the end of a species' time on Earth, it would go extinct or else emerge into one or more new species. So according to Darwin, that's what we would expect from an evolutionary model. We can easily compare that to a design or creation model, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking design or creation, the same argument follows. Design or creation would predict a sudden appearance of new species. Species will come about all of a sudden. It won't be a gradual process. Secondly, it would predict that there's stasis, that is structural stability. It will change over time. Species will not change much in the fossil record. And finally, extinction, if the species is not alive anymore, extinction occurs due to changes in the environment, as we talked about before, or else genetic degradation. And finally, lack of transitional forms between species. The evolution is not occurring, you're not going to have transitional forms between like a bacterium and a fish. So what does the real fossil record show? This is taken from a high school introductory college biology book called Biology Concepts and Conceptions. It's a very typical biology book. And this is what they say about the fossils. Most fossil species appear suddenly without transitional forms in a layer of rock and persist essentially unchanged until disappearing from the record of the rocks as suddenly as they appeared. Now, this is from a biology book that teaches evolution. Interesting. Again, the fossil evidence shows sudden appearance, stasis or stability, disappearance, lack of transitional forms. Unguided evolution predicts gradual changes, changes while the species is on Earth, emergence of new species gradually, and many transitional forms. Creation or design, on the other hand, predicts exactly what we see in the fossil record. It seems pretty clear. A little bit more about the fossil record. Some of you probably have heard of the Cambrian explosion. I'm not going to get into ages and the age debate, because I personally have questions about the ages of the Earth, and I don't know the answers. I'm studying it, and hopefully in the future I'll have some better idea. But at the moment, I don't want to dispute the geological time scale. I don't want to advocate it either. But anyway, according to the geological time scale, about 530 million years ago, there was a sudden burst in animal life. And that's called the Cambrian explosion because it occurred at the beginning of the Cambrian era in geology. This was a remarkable short period in which most of the animal phyla that exist or have existed came into being. In fact, it's estimated about 85% of all animal phyla first appeared in the Cambrian. This is a quote from Jonathan Wells, Icons of Evolution. The Cambrian explosion presents a serious challenge to Darwinian evolution. The event was remarkable because it was so abrupt and extensive, and because so many major groups of animals made their debut in it. The early animal life on Earth was all single-celled until in the late Precambrian. There were prokaryotes, which are cells without nuclei, the eukaryotes, single cells with nuclei. And then at the beginning of the Cambrian, we had all of this outburst of new phyla, new body plans, new body parts that had never been seen before. And they occurred in a very brief moment of geologic time. And it's very hard to explain, essentially not possible to explain by evolutionary mechanisms. What about missing links? Darwin himself was pretty honest in his book. He's a lot more honest than a lot of biologists today. He understood the problem of missing transition forms, and he said in Origin of Species, the distinctness of specific forms or species and their not being blended together by innumerable transition links is a very obvious difficulty with my theory. Darwin had an answer, though. He said it cannot be doubted that the geological, as a fossil record, viewed as a whole, is extremely imperfect. So Darwin's excuse was, well, we really haven't explored all the fossil fields that well, and once we get more data and more fossils, we'll fill in the missing links. Well, a lot more fossils have been collected over the last 150 years, but the transitional forms are still missing. And I think most paleontologists would agree that they're not going to show up at this point. Archaeopteryx is an interesting sidelight. Archaeopteryx was an early bird. It was once thought to be a transitional form between dinosaurs and birds. Jonathan Wells, in Icons of Evolution, said both sides agree that modern birds are probably not descended from Archaeopteryx. So Archaeopteryx was a bird, it was not a dinosaur, even though it kind of looks like it might have come from a dinosaur. It's interesting to note that modern paleontologists also recognize the problem with the fossil record. And so two paleontologists who are very well known, Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard and Niles Eldredge, introduced a theory they called punctuated equilibrium, or PUNC-EQ, the shortened version, as a possible solution. And this was 1972. And Gould admitted that the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record is the trade secret of paleontology. That is, it's not something they like to talk about in public. They'll talk about it among themselves, but they don't want to talk about it in public. They proposed that stasis, or species stability, was a norm during long periods of time, And then when a sudden change in the environment occurred, like a volcano or isolation of the population or various other environmental disasters, this caused rapid evolutionary change. That's a nice theory, but there's really no evidence for it. There's no feasible mechanism. It involves very rapid evolution, and there is no mechanism for evolution, or especially rapid evolution. Philip Johnson and Darwin on Trial said punk-eat turns out to be only a meaningless middle ground somewhere between evolution and special creation. And when I first heard about it, when I read Philip Johnson's book, I said, well, punk-eat sounds like a miracle. And pretty much does. Human evolution, that's a debatable topic. First of all, it should be noted that the fossil evidence is meager, it's very small. One paleontologist said that all the evidence of human fossils and evolutionary can be put into a small box. And that's basically true. There's not much fossil evidence out there, but every time something comes up and somebody finds something new, it usually makes front page news, at least for a few days. And, oh, this is the missing link. The interpretation of these fossils is questionable. Jonathan Wells says individual specimens can be reconstructed in a variety of ways. If we look at this fossil spectrum fossil over here, which is Lucy, an ape fossil, a very well-known fossil, this is an artist's conception of what Lucy might have looked like, but who knows if it's at all valid or not. In fact, Lucy was an ape, an ancient ape, and was not human. And whether she evolved into a human down the line is totally speculative. But materialistic biologists want human evolution to be true. They assume it's true because humans are no different to them than anybody else. Scientists, Jonathan Wells says, like everyone else, can be fooled into seeing what they want to see. The thing is, humans are vastly different than other animals. Yeah, we possess some of the same body parts, but we also possess consciousness, a mind, and a spirit, a soul. And these are non-material entities. That is, they cannot be explained by material processes. And they cannot be produced by material processes. You can't create non-material entities like a mind and a soul from material processes. It requires an intelligent agent. So these lines of descent have been drawn. They're very questionable, but many biologists believe them. I think one reason not to believe them is that they predict that human evolution goes back about 5 or 6 million years, which is like 200,000 generations. During that time, genetic degradation should have resulted in total loss of fitness and extinction well before 5 million years. Henry G., who's a very well-known biologist, said to take a line of fossils and claim they represent a lineage, that is, a line going back, is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Okay, there are lots of lines of evidence, and I've listed several of them here. And obviously I don't have time to talk about it. I've only talked about one, the fossil record. But if you look at any of these, and interpret them either in terms of biological evolution or in terms of design or creation, you will find that design or creation provides as good an explanation, and usually a much better explanation in every case, whatever the evidence is. The fossil record is really the most common type of evidence and the one most people are familiar with. But there's lots of other evidence as well. If you look into the biology books, many of them discuss this evidence, but they only discuss it in terms that tend or purport to support unguided evolution. They don't even consider the alternative of design. In summary, why design by an intelligent agent is a better explanation for the universe and life. First, we looked at the Big Bang. It implies the universe had a beginning. Anything that has a beginning must have a beginner. a designer creator. There are no feasible naturalistic mechanisms for the origin of complex molecules, cells, and information in DNA and the genetic code. How did the genetic code come about? They have no idea. How did DNA come about? They have no idea. The neo-Darwinian mechanism is not feasible, and many evolutionary biologists realize that today, but they don't have any better explanation at this point, but they keep hoping they'll find one. Pattern of the fossil record, sudden appearance, spacious extinction, lack of transitional forms, supports design and creation, but definitely not unguided evolution. Again, design creation compared to evolution provides better explanations for various lines of evidence from nature. So I am often called on to talk about this issue. When I first got into this business 20 years ago, I asked myself, boy, is this going to test my faith? Because everybody believes in evolution. Am I going to study evolution and find that it has some validity to it? Well, I quickly realized that evolution has no feet to stand on. It's totally nonsensical. It's totally unrealistic. Design and creation have strong scientific evidence for their validity. And eventually that's going to win out. It may not be in this generation. In fact, it probably won't be. But in the future, at some point in time, people are going to realize that design and creation are the way to go. Thanks.
Okay, to take some questions?
Sure.
Okay.